You mentioned confabulation a few moments ago and traumatic brain injury. Can you explain to the jury what a concussion is?
Okay, so I should first go into the terminology because we use them interchangeably. So concussion. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear.
Okay. Concussion and TBI and traumatic brain injury, they're all terms that are used interchangeably. And so how that happens is there's an external force that causes the brain to shake back and forth inside the head. There could be an acceleration, deceleration injury. There could even be a rotational component to that, and it causes a large number of signs and symptoms.
Is there a method by which whether a traumatic brain injury has occurred is evaluated by physicians such as yourself? In other words, is there some criteria that is followed?
Yes, so the American Congress of Rehabilitation Medicine published a very nice, very clear, concise diagnostic criteria that most of us use to establish whether or not someone had a traumatic brain injury.
Is this a criteria that you have previously used prior to this case?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Your Honor, if I could have Dr. Barratt step down. I've shared with the prosecutors in this case a demonstrative exhibit that we would like to share with the jury.
Yes.
Is there going to be marked somewhere? Yes, Your Honor, I have. Thank you.
Yeah, we can mark. For the record, this is Defense Exhibit A37 for identification. Okay, Professor. Judge, are you able to see?
Just push it back a little bit. No? Just.
Carlos, there's a mirror.
There you go. Got it.
Okay, so it's a little gray, but I think you can...
Now, I need you to keep your voice up if you will, please.
Okay, I'll try. So, as I mentioned, these are the diagnostic criteria from the American Congress of Rehabilitation Medicine. And there are a number of ways that you can confirm the diagnosis of traumatic brain injury. They gave us a few different pathways. So you could have just clinical signs, and that would be something that is observed at the scene of an injury. And then there's another pathway, if maybe they weren't witnessed or maybe they didn't have any of the clinical signs that I will go over in a minute. They can have acute symptoms. So symptoms would be what the patient reports. So I have a headache, or I feel nauseated, or I feel dizzy. And if they only had acute symptoms without those signs, it has to be paired with clinical examination findings.
When you say acute symptoms, what do you mean by acute symptoms?
Things that happen right away, more immediate symptoms, and it would mean within 72 hours. If something happened after 72 hours, it might not be from the traumatic brain injury. These criteria wouldn't really apply.
So these are symptoms that you're looking for within the first 72 hours of a traumatic event?
Yes.
Head trauma event, is that right?
Yes. And then if they don't have clinical sign, and they only need one clinical sign. And if they don't have the symptoms plus the clinical examination findings, if there's a neuroimaging abnormality, so the CAT scan showed blood in the brain, or if the MRI showed damage to the brain that looked like it should happen, then they would qualify as a traumatic brain injury. And then I'll go into this more later, but criterion 6 is that's not accounted for by other factors, so maybe somebody was found unconscious and we don't know if they're dead or not. They have a fainting episode or they have a heart attack and they're on the floor, so they are unconscious, but you don't know how it happened. So,
Let me direct you to right back up at the top, the criterion 1 box, mechanism of injury, in parentheses, plausible. What is being referred to as the mechanism of injury? What is meant by that?
okay, so I have a separate slide on that. So in traumatic brain injury, there's a transfer of mechanical energy to the brain. And these criteria gives examples of that. So either the head is struck with an object, the head strikes an object. There could be maybe a whiplash injury where the person undergoes an acceleration, deceleration event, and the brain is shaking around inside the skull, but there's no contact between the head and another surface.
Is that like a whiplash situation?
Like a whiplash, yes.
So, for example, if someone is in a car with the seatbelt on, and there should be a head-on collision, the person's head may not make contact with any object, but just the forward acceleration because of the forward momentum of the vehicle. Is that right?
Objection to leading, Your Honor.
Okay, don't leave, let the witnesses.
I apologize, that's correct.
Okay, so yes, in a whiplash injury, in a restrained passenger, there could be an acceleration, deceleration injury, and you don't know how many times the person's brain is shaking back and forth inside the skull, but just the contact inside the skull could cause traumatic brain injury.
How is the brain injured by making contact with the skull?
So it could directly damage the nerve cells, and then there are projections called axons. All of the nerve cells are sending axons to other places in the brain to connect with other cells, or even to parts of the body to control your muscles. And those axons can be stretched, and that can cause immediate dysfunction, or they can actually be cut. They can be sheared by the injury.
So under normal circumstances, is the brain not in contact with the skull at any time?
So it's not banging into the skull. I mean, with babies, their brains are so big they fill their skulls. And as we get older, unfortunately, our brains get a little bit smaller every year. And so at some point, there is space, you can see space between the person's brain and the skull. And that can make you more vulnerable because there's more movement. And the veins can tear.
Please be.
Okay, and so the American Congress of Rehabilitation Medicine has also given us another way that the mechanism of injury could occur, so a blast injury or an explosion, where maybe nothing hard has hit the head, but there is still acceleration, deceleration, maybe rotation of the brain inside the skull. Okay, so if you have a plausible mechanism of injury, like okay. If you have a plausible mechanism of injury, so there is a motor vehicle accident, fall, with head trauma, then you go down this first arm, and you only need one clinical sign, and those clinical signs can be witnessed loss of consciousness immediately after the injury, alteration of mental status, and I'll expound upon that in a minute. There could be complete or partial amnesia. And there's another category with motor coordination, posture, and seizure.
Doctor, can you explain to us what, when you use the term amnesia, can you explain what that means more precisely?
Okay, I'll skip that slide. So amnesia occurs in a traumatic brain injury, and it's not always like it is in the news where they forget their name or they forget forget who they are, important details of their lives. They can forget things that happen immediately preceding the injury, and then things immediately after the injury. And sometimes they have trouble retrieving old memories. And so retrograde amnesia would mean they can't remember what happened right before the injury. And that could be because they were recording all the events, you're paying attention to all the events, and then suddenly you get a head injury, you haven't had time to store those events in your memory. Right after the injury, your brain is damaged, and so you could have trouble storing memory, and you could also have trouble retrieving older memories.
What is the opposite of retrograde amnesia?
So there's retrograde amnesia, which means you forgot what happened right before the accident. And then I use the term anterograde, as you can't form new memories right after the accident. And then in this document they use post-traumatic amnesia, and it's synonymous with anterograde. I'll just go back a slide. So loss of consciousness is pretty straightforward, right? So you see somebody unconscious and unresponsive. Alteration of mental status. I'm going to get a drink of water or something. So alteration of mental status, they defined it as someone who has reduced responsiveness, or maybe they're responding but it's not appropriate to the stimuli. They're slow to respond, they could be agitated, and then if you give them a two-part command, like pick up your right hand and use it to touch your left ear, they can't put it together, they can't follow two-step commands, or they could just be disoriented to person, place, and time. And then we went over the amnesia.
Doctor, if you go back one moment, 2 slides. The reduced responsiveness. If you could tell us, expound on that a little bit more. So, for example, hypothetically, if someone is given a command, a single command, for example, move, get out, look here, look there, a failure to respond, the person who's listening to that, who has suffered a concussion, what would that be indicative of?
So that's one of the clinical signs that defines the diagnosis of traumatic brain injury. And you only need one of these of that list. I'll go back to that. So you only need one to determine that someone meets diagnostic criteria for traumatic brain injury. So either loss of consciousness, or alteration of mental status, or amnesia, or this other category of seizure or time posturing.
So any one of those 4 items that is part of the criteria establishing traumatic brain injury, is that what you're saying?
Yes, you only need one of those. You need the mechanism of injury, and you need one of these signs. And then as long as there's not some other factor, like the person fainted, or the person had a seizure, and that's why they're relying on the adrenaline on the floor. As long as you don't have one of those, they don't need diagnostic criteria, or traumatic brain injury, or concussion, or TBI. Okay, so we kind of went over this already. If there's not another reason that the person was unconscious, then they meet the diagnostic criteria for traumatic brain injury.
Dr. Barratt, you gave an explanation with regard to amnesia, both retrograde amnesia and anterograde amnesia. You mentioned the word confabulation. What is that exactly?
So confabulation, it's something that we teach in medical schools, mainly pertaining to certain types of dementia. So the person is really struggling with their memory, and they create a false memory. They have no intention of trying to deceive anybody, but they're confused and they come up with something that's not correct.
Other than confabulation being a sign of dementia, is there any other association that confabulation might have with amnesia?
Well, so what I didn't say is that it usually we teach it in the context of a type of dementia called Wernicke-Korsakoff, but it's also in the literature pertaining to patients with Alzheimer's and other types of dementia, and it's also occurring in patients with traumatic brain injury. And so they are not collecting a lot of data on confabulation in general.
When you say they, who are you referring to?
Like people that are doing clinical trials and developing frameworks such as this, there isn't really data for them to look at in terms of confabulation, but the confabulation would be a byproduct or a result of amnesia, because the individual's really struggling with their memory, and then they generate a false memory.
Is there a connection between a concussion, traumatic brain injury, and confabulation?
Yeah, and that connection would be that they're struggling with their memory. They may have amnesia, they're having cognitive issues, and they say something that's just not correct.
When a person who is experiencing confabulation says something that is not correct, is the person being intentionally incorrect in what they're saying?
No, that's the definition of it, that they're filling in the gaps with a false memory without the intention of deceiving anybody.
And when you say false memory, would that include memories from actual previous events in a person's life?
It could be. They could be misplacing that memory in time, or they could be generating something that didn't, that has no relevance.
Is confabulation taught in medical school?
Yeah, I taught that lecture on it was pertaining to Wernicke-Korsakoff dementia.
You mentioned something about filling gaps when you were in the context of confabulation. Can you expound on that a bit more for the jury?
So in a person who's had a traumatic brain injury, they are not remembering. So in order to remember something, you have to be recording it. So if you're unconscious, obviously you're not recording anything. But if you're awake, you are recording information. But you need to store that information, and then you need to be able to retrieve that information later. So in somebody that has amnesia, they might not have had the opportunity to store that information because the impact occurred right as they were recording that information. And then after the impact, they have brain damage, and so they might not be able to store those memories, or they might not be able to retrieve older memories.
In terms of confabulation, are older memories sometimes substituted for a current event?
It could be.
Have you experienced patients that are experiencing confabulation?
Yes, dementia patients, they forget things and then they fill in the gaps with other information.
When filling in gaps with other information, are those persons trying to be deceptive?
No. Sometimes they just don't remember. They used to bank with a certain institution and then they closed that account years ago, but they might not remember that they closed it. So they show up at the bank looking for their funds and the funds aren't available.
Is there any medical study or history which connects a person who has suffered a traumatic brain injury with confabulation?
There are studies on it. I just found a document recently, but I didn't have a chance to read the whole thing. But yeah, they do think more data should be collected on confabulation.
How soon after a person experiences a traumatic brain injury would they actually start to experience amnesia, for example? of the event?
I mean, it could be immediately upon awakening from the loss of consciousness, or it could be maybe they didn't lose consciousness, maybe they just have difficulty with their memory. It could be immediately after the impact.
Same question with confabulation. If a person suffers a traumatic brain injury, how soon after could confabulation enter the picture?
It could be immediate.
Is there and this was one of the questions that you were asked coming into this case as a consultant, but how long might a circumstance of confabulation persist?
It's indefinite.
Might it resolve itself on its own at some point?
It could.
Okay. And if it resolved it, how would it resolve itself on its own?
How we don't really understand the mechanisms of confabulation. I mean, there are many theories about this circuit of the brain and that circuit of the brain, but there's nothing conclusive, so we don't know.
It's a poorly worded question on my part. What I was trying to ask, doctor, is that if a person is experiencing confabulation, a false memory, for example, is it the case that that person could then remember what reality was with regard to the instant?
They could. Over time, they might have a more accurate memory.
In regards to this case, can you explain or let the jury know what procedures, what methods you undertook to answer the questions that were asked of you in this case?
So if it's a case of traumatic brain injury, I always want three things. I want the accident report, usually generated by police, and I want the EMS records. And usually the police arrive first, so they might see something that is no longer a factor after EMS arrives. And then I want the EMS records, and then I want the emergency department records.
Now, all of the things that you just mentioned, the police report records, but particularly the EMS or the fire rescue records, is that right? EMS, fire rescue?
Yes.
Same thing? All right, so particularly with regard to the fire rescue records and the hospital records, is timing important for your evaluation as to whether someone had a traumatic brain injury or a concussion?
Yes, because as I showed in the graphic, it matters what was seen at the scene of the event. So if there was loss of consciousness, if it happened 5 days later, it really doesn't fall within those diagnostic criteria. But if the patient lost consciousness after the impact, or if the patient had amnesia directly after the impact, if these things were witnessed, then that confirms the diagnosis of traumatic brain injury.
Would records, either from fire rescue or a hospital, records that, let's say, for example, let me back up. Let's say that a traumatic event, a boating accident, a car accident occurs on January 1st of any given year. Would medical records that were generated a year later be of any value to you in determining whether the individual suffered a concussion back on January 1st?
Probably not. It should be all in the records from the first 72 hours. I mean, there's one instance I can think of where maybe the patient didn't get brain imaging, and they get it done much later, and it does show that there was trauma to the brain as a specific, maybe they have contusions of their frontal lobes or their temporal lobes on both sides. So something like that, if I couldn't make the diagnosis of traumatic brain injury from the records from the first 72 hours, it's possible that it could be diagnosed years later, but then you wouldn't know if it occurred right at that moment or occurred before or after.
With regard to the imaging that you would not know, could you explain that a little bit?
The imaging, yeah. I mean, how would you know the patient didn't have another traumatic brain injury after the first one or have a prior one?
So,
It'd be hard to date the image. You could just see that a traumatic brain injury happened at some point in time.
oh. In this particular case, did you receive the records that you like to have generally, that you just explained a few moments ago, in order to make a determination as to whether Mr. Pino suffered a concussion or traumatic brain injury?
I did. I received the report from the Fish and Wildlife, and I received the EMS records from Fire Rescue, and I received a small amount of records from Baptist, Maine, and then I contacted the law firm because I could tell that all of the notes weren't in there, and then I was later sent a more complete set of records.
And when you say the law firm, you're talking about my law firm,
Yes.
is that right? Once you had all of those records, were you able to make a determination as to whether Mr. Pino, number one, had a mechanical means by which a head trauma occurred, and whether there was enough evidence based on the records to establish a loss of consciousness or any of the other factors that we just talked about in the criteria?
Yes, I could see that he had a plausible mechanism of injury. He had a scalp hematoma, and it required 7 staples.
What does that mean, a scalp hematoma?
A scalp hematoma, so when he bumped his head, there was like blood accumulating under the surface of the skin, and there was a laceration, so they had to repair it with staples. Throughout the medical record, and it said that he was witnessed unconscious on the boat, and so that automatically made it very clear that he meets the diagnostic criteria for traumatic brain injury. He also had he had amnesia, retrograde and anterograde or post-traumatic amnesia, but that wasn't even necessary to make the diagnosis.
Let's talk with regard back to the diagnosis, and we'll get to amnesia in a moment. In addition to those records, were you aware of any eyewitness testimony as to whether Mr. Pino lost consciousness at any time?
I had a deposition transcript from a witness, and that said that he was seen unconscious.
Did you have an opportunity to note if Mr. Pino had injured his denture, his teeth in any way as a result of the accident?
Yes, I received some records that showed that he'd been to the dentist, and there were pictures of broken teeth.
So with regard to the pictures of broken teeth, assuming that the broken teeth did not predate the accident, is that significant in any way in your analysis?
Well, it's not needed to make a diagnosis of traumatic brain injury, but it fits the whole clinical picture.
How does it fit the whole clinical picture? Explain that.
Well, that there was trauma to the face and to the head.
You mentioned a moment ago amnesia. Did you make a determination as to whether amnesia was present as a result of the traumatic brain injury?
So I reviewed the videos of...
Which videos?
So he was interviewed by Fish and Wildlife after the accident, and there were a number of instances in which he said that he was very clear about what happened, and then he said, well, maybe that... Well, I'm not really sure, and then he would give the wrong answer, and this happened a number of times during his interview. So in one instance, he said, oh, I know exactly who was sitting behind me, and then he said, well, I'm pretty sure who was sitting behind me, and then he said the names of 2 girls. And
what were the names of the girls?
Coco and Andrea, I believe. And then, but in the report that came out from Fish and Wildlife, there were 2 different people sitting there.
Are you saying, Dr. Barratt, that the fact that Mr. Pino may have been mistaken about who was sitting in the back, that just because he made a mistake, that's evidence of amnesia?
Well, if it's just that one thing, maybe I wouldn't think of that, but he made other mistakes too. So he said, this is the size of my engines on my boat, and that turned out to be incorrect.
Do you recall what he said and how it is that he turned out to be incorrect?
He said it was, I'm not a boat owner, but he said he had 225 engines, and then when the final report came out, it said that he had 300 engines on his boat. And then he made other errors also. They asked him, what did you see after you were first ejected? And he said, oh, I know exactly what I saw. And then he couldn't come up with what he saw. And then he said, it was really scary. And now I'm having a problem recalling. And then he had another episode where he said, I'm very clear who was under the boat. And then he said it was Natty. He kept repeating, Natty was under the boat. And then later he said it was Lucy under the boat. And then the report came out that it was Luciana.
Are you aware whether or not the police report that you reviewed indicated, in fact, who was under the boat in this case? Is that right?
Yes.
And was it your determination, based on learning that information, the police report, that Mr. Pino was mistaken when he said it was Nati who was under the boat?
Yes, and it's not a mistake you would expect someone to make.
So all of these things together, is it the how do you characterize all of these mistakes and facts with regard to your diagnosis of amnesia?
When you look at the whole clinical picture, he did have the plausible mechanism of injury. He did have loss of consciousness, so he automatically meets the diagnosis for traumatic brain injury. And then when he wakes up, I could understand someone not remembering exactly who was sitting behind them, but he would remember what size engine he has. He would remember the name of the girl that was under the boat. And so these are mistakes that no one should make, and it fits with the clinical picture of amnesia.
And would you characterize that or categorize that as retrograde amnesia or anterograde?
So there were aspects of both. So if it were something that happened right before the injury, and he couldn't remember that, then that's retrograde amnesia. If it's something that happened after the impact, that would be anterograde or post-traumatic amnesia. And there were examples of both